Good morning. I'm excited about today's devotional because this is some this is some stuff that a lot of people kind of pass through, or they've heard a sermon around the parable of the talents before, but they've never kind of dug into the fact that the two versions of the parable of the talents are significantly different. In fact, we're going to kind of talk about that today. So the first one is in Luke. The first one I'm talking about is in Luke 19, verses 11 through 27. The second one is in Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. And these are some of the harder ones, like when you look at it on its surface. And honestly, it's hard for me to think of these truly moment by moment without remembering sermons I've heard about, like how we use our talents. Because if you just kind of blaze through it and you've heard a sermon, it can sound like too much, similar to the Superman quote, right? Like, too much is given, much is expected, or someone else there, please fix that quote in the comments. I would love to remember that correctly. But in the parable of talents, there's some stuff that's left out. First off, it is taught as a parable. Jesus is not saying the master is God, okay? So when you read it, each one of them kind of has a different implications. Both of them kind of go with this basic format. There are three different servants. The master's leaving, and he leaves a separate amount of money with each one of them, okay? One is given, in one story, 5 and 3 and 1, and the other is 10, 5 and 1. And so, but at the end of Luke, see, this is where, so at the end they kind of change a little bit. At the end of Luke, we see that it finishes with the master saying, so it ends with everyone doubles their money except for the slave or the servant who only got 1 talent, which is like a year's worth of gold. So he says he kind of goes through this and he says, "You wicked and lazy servant, take his money, give it to the one who has even more, because he can do something with it." But then in Luke, it says, "As for my enemies who don't want me to be their king, bring them here and slaughter them before me." Doesn't seem very Christ-like to me. And so this is a pretty interesting one, because that, to me, is very counterintuitive to the way that Jesus teaches in the New Testament, and the way that he teaches throughout the book of Luke. And what's actually happening here is, rather than that being God, what we're seeing is that is the implication. This is a lesson about what was just said. So any time when you're reading scripture and you're going, this seems a little confusing, start out first off by backing up and reading passages before that, and see what happened right before that. Because a lot of times in the Gospel of Luke, you have this moment where what has happened before literally informs what is still happening, but because we segment it with these little sections that say faithful service or parable of the talents, we don't look back because we think that's the only spot that it is talking about that specific issue. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Peggy. So, but it's not. That's not how it was written, and that's not how so many of the books are written. So whenever you're like confused or wondering what something really means, go backwards a little bit, okay? So if you go backwards, the story right before this is the story of Zacchaeus. Now, if you don't know this story, Jesus enters Jericho. Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus. Zacchaeus is a short man, tax collector, aka hated by everybody, because he takes their money. He also is seen as one of the Romans who's oppressing them. And so Zacchaeus has to go. They won't let him see Jesus. They're all too tall and standing in the way. So Zacchaeus climbs a tree. Jesus walks under the tree and says, "I'm coming to your house today." And then it finishes with, "Today salvation has come to this household, because he too is the son of Abraham. The human one," and the CEB, or the Son of Man, "has come to seek and save the lost." And then he goes into the story about the parable of the talents. What's happening here is Jesus is making a commentary on the economy, and specifically their economy is drastically different than ours. So in the first century, they had a closed economic system, which means that you could not come up with a new idea and make money from investments and kind of what we would call well, what's imaginary money, right? Like invested money that you don't have to have in hand. Everything was held in hand, but the majority of the economy happened as a trade or barter system. So only people usually only had enough money to kind of make up the difference in how much things costed. If you were trading a cow for a goat, you might need that goat more than you need the cow, but the cow's still worth more. So there might be a small amount of money that went with the goat to finish paying for that part of the cow. But what I'm saying is, in order for those three people to have doubled their money, someone had to lose money. So if they didn't give away new resources or grow more cattle, and there's not really enough time for them to have done that, then they must have taken that from someone else. So actually, this passage in Luke is a condemnation of going into other places and taking money from folks. So those guys must have been pretty ruthless, especially the one who had 5 and ended up with 10. But that's just Luke, right? So Luke gets into that and then leaves that there. And so the message for the people that Luke is writing to, and so I like to really think about the gospel writers as Pastor Luke or Pastor Matthew or Pastor Mark or Pastor John, because it reminds us they're writing to a specific group of people. And when we can understand that, then it makes it easier to understand how that might apply to our lives. So, the tax collector, we got the Zacchaeus story, and then straight into this is what's wrong with our world when we take from other people to give one person even more, and that person then goes on to destroy anyone who thought differently than them. Specifically looking at any enemies they have should be destroyed and slaughtered. So we can see how that's not directly God. The other thing to note when you're reading a parable is that if Jesus is telling it, unless he says this is God, a lot of times that is our adjustment of that story to kind of help us with our faith. So let's be clear that anytime a parable is done, the point is the lesson in it, not for us to figure out exactly who Jesus is in that story or who we are. Okay, so let's go to the other parable passage in Matthew 25. Hey, Calvin, how are you? So we're looking at Matthew 25, which goes into the parable section there is 14 through 30. And in the end of that one, it ends with, as for this worthless slave, throw him in the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So this is a section of parables, but then it goes into, so this one we're going to get a little bit more context if we watch what's coming next, which is the judgment of nations. So when you get into Matthew, so essentially it's the same story. 2 of the servants doubled their money, 1 servant did not. So now we're not talking about the same context that Luke was writing to. We're talking about Matthew, who is working with primarily, at least this is what it implies because of all the references to the Old Testament, primarily working with the Jews, trying to explain to them how their God is 3 in 1, and that's kind of a difficult thing to do. So in this part, it gets into this, it moves from a literal sense of money into kind of a figurative one, because we see, figurative and literal. When you get into the judgment of the nations, it gives us more context. So in the beginning, we see that the one who didn't do anything with what they had was thrown into this place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. And that then goes into the story of the separation of the nations, the judgment of the nations by their deeds. They're separated into sheep and goats. You want to be a sheep in this story, but the end separation there, Jesus says the difference between the two is that those who helped the least of these are the sheep, and the sheep get blessings. And those who did not help the least of these are goats. So we can see that if we look at that parable of the talents with respect to what Jesus went on to talk about next, that the idea behind it is that what we are given, what we have, whether that is money, whether that is resources, whether that is power or respect, whether that's spiritual gifts, if we have many, many gifts and blessings in that way, and we don't use them to help, then there is something very, very wrong with that. And if we do, then we get to this space where we're set aside to make a difference in the world, and or we're set aside in the sense of a peace and acceptance. The key to this is not just an investment profile, right? It's not just taking a look at, you literally had, let's say, $5,000 and you invested it, and then you had $10,000, and God goes, now you got to go to heaven. Because then he moves on down to the next thing and goes, what you do with that money or those talents or that time has everything to do with, did you help the least? Did you help those who are suffering? Did you help those in need? Did you make the world a better place? Did you bring about the kingdom of heaven? So, summing up real quick, Luke gets us into this place where it's a condemnation of taking from other people to become wealthy. And I think we can all agree with that, or I hope we can agree with that. If not, seriously, this is one you got to take to Jesus. But then we get into Matthew, and Matthew's is pointing out that the gifts and graces, financial, personal, time, etc., if we are not using those for good, if we are not taking that piece that we have and doubling it, if we're not taking the gifts we have and sharing it, then we are at risk in that space of, what's going to happen next, weeping and gnashing of teeth. I think that's a mourning. I think at some point we'll come face to face, not necessarily as a punishment, but that our hearts will truly know the depth of what it was that we didn't do. And to me, that's a pretty rough day. So this is why throughout the New Testament, throughout Christendom, if we're really truly doing what God wanted, it's not just a matter of living an ascetic life. And some people are called to that. It's a matter of taking the gifts that you have and working with one another. And whether, and this is definitely could be financial. If you are an amazing business person, I once heard someone who said, I feel called to ministry, but I am a great business person, so I'm going to continue to do my business this way and give at a level that allows those ministries to happen at much more than they would if I hadn't had this ability to do good business and make money. And that is a very valid calling. We see that the point of this is what we do with it once we have it. So if you find yourself as being able to be a more peaceful, gracious, calm person in your soul, and this is something you've learned over your life, then the point is to share that, teach that, offer it up. And so often we can get stuck in these places where we're waiting to have the perfect example, or we're waiting to say, God, you have to tell me now in a very burning bush moment, set something on fire, and that's when I will admit that I'm ready to do what you want. But that's not how Jesus kind of separates this stuff. He says, this is about like what you're using, what you have, what you've been gifted with. Now use that. So you don't need to, if you're not a public speaker, you don't need to go make 1,000 Facebook videos. But to share those gifts that you've got, to make the kingdom better, to work in those spaces of difficulty and brokenness and sorrow. And here's the reality is that could be a huge blessing to us. But we also need to be aware, just like in Luke, that there are real serious issues in justice, and that there are people being persecuted and hurt and broken and beat down. And we have to be aware that our actions, even on a basic investment plane, can impact someone else's livelihood in such a way that they may, that our decisions on where to buy things or what to use can harm others. Okay, so that was really heavy. But the other point, the final wrap up here is when you're reading the scripture, read the scripture. Read before it, read a little after it, and if it still doesn't make that sense, call me, shoot me a message. My favorite part of doing these daily devotions is answering your questions. So send them in. I mean, it really varied. You got a personal question, you got I can leave your name out. If there's something you're slightly embarrassed to wonder about, but you still want to know, I can answer those things as well. I love doing this. I hope you have a blessed day, and that you get to dig in a little bit more to Scripture this week. God bless you.